This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Dr. Jonathan Larson, and he is an extension entomologist in the Department of Entomology at the University of Kentucky. And it's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
Howdy, howdy. It's very good to be here today. Thank you.
So today, this is our Halloween special.
Right.
Yay! So we're going to be talking about creepy things from the forest. Before we talk about some of these creepy things in the forest, tell us a little bit about what you do here at UK.
Okay. I'm one of the creepy things from the forest, right?
Yeah.
So I'm an extension entomologist in the Department of Entomology. If anybody has questions on things with 6 or more legs that's in their house, in their garden, in their trees, I'm happy to try and help you identify it or get pest management tools that are going to help you get rid of it if it's a bad bug.
And so what got you interested in entomology?
Oh, man. So when I was like 13 or 14, I was a 10-year 4-H'er when I was a kid back in Indiana. And my dad had a rule that if you did a project outside, like if you showed an animal, you had to have a project in the building as well. And I used to do art and rockets and stuff. And one year I saw entomology in the guidebook. I was like, that sounds weird. What's that? And I Googled it or Yahoo'd it or Alta Vista'd it or whatever it was at that time and found out what it was. And I thought I could do that. And I made a collection of about 40 or 50 insects and entered it. And I won my county.
Oh, that's great.
I was the only entrant, so it's not that impressive. And when you go to the state fair in Indiana, they used to have a program where you go to the Department of Entomology. You'd meet some of those folks there and go to a class. And I thought, this is really weird. I like being outside. I like experiencing all these weird creatures that are fluttering around and crawling around. And apparently, you can have a job with this.
Right.
And I was always interested in teaching and science communication and things like that. And I always thought entomology was a really good avenue for it. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Good. Oh, that's great.
Today, again, we're going to be talking about creepy things in the forest, so tell us some of those creepy things.
Well, some of the ones I brought with me today just to think about would be things like spiders. I know that creeps a lot of folks out. They don't like running into them. When I talk about spiders with people, I always ask them when they say they're afraid, because that's usually their first reaction. What is it about spiders that you don't like? Do you two like spiders?
I do not.
No? So could you share one of the reasons why? Like, what is it about spiders that disturbs you or bugs you?
I don't know. When you mentioned that got me thinking, I don't know. They're kind of crunchy. I don't know.
It's almost unquantifiable, though, for some
they're
folks.
just,
It's like innate, almost, to
Yeah,
some
right.
people. I think some people argue that that's built in. Like, people have survived by avoiding venomous things like spiders, and so it's almost hardwired into us. But some of the like concrete things people mention are they have too many legs, they're too hairy, their eyes are too big. And I think it's unfortunate because spiders are beneficial pieces of the ecosystem. They help control lots of stuff, particularly out in the woods. If you were out there wandering around looking for stuff, you could find the 2 main categories of spiders that we usually break them into are the web builders and then the active hunters. In the woods, I'd say you're probably going to find more of those active hunters, the ones that are actually looking, they're big and strong, and they want to catch their food and gobble it down. The biggest one that you could encounter would probably be the Dolomedes fishing spider. It is tarantula-sized.
Oh.
It has thin legs. If you include the legs and the body, they can be several inches wide. They do sometimes hang out near streams and ponds, and they can reach down into the water and snag minnows and eat them. They also hang out on the sides of people's garages or get into their house. So if you have a more wooded home, you might experience some of those hanging out near your house.
So you said some of web and then not. Does
Right.
not all spiders do webs?
So all spiders are able to produce silk. They all have silk glands in their body. It just depends on what species you're talking about, what they're going to use it for. The orb weavers, like the barn spider or the marbled orb weaver, or even the black and yellow garden spider that a lot of people see, they construct those big circular webs that are sticky to catch their food. Things like the fishing spider, they can make silk, but they're going to use it to line an area that they hang out in or to construct an egg sac. So they're a little more primitive comparatively to some of those other spiders, but they still use that tool. Yeah.
So what are the typical spiders you find in your house?
In your house? Okay. In this time of year, as we start to transition to autumn, we can see things like the tiger wolf spider. That's one of the common home invaders. They'll follow their food into your home, crickets that are coming in, things like that. So wolf spiders are also big and beefy kind of spiders, can be a couple inches, 3 inches across with their legs. The tiger wolf spider is unique because it has kind of an orange mohawk on the back of its head that separates it from the Carolina wolf spider, which is big and gray, and then the rabid wolf spider, which has lots of odd sort of tribal design markings, like a tribal tattoo, you know what I mean, on the back of its abdomen. So those are some common ones that get inside. We also have the house spider, which is not very creatively named. Entomologists tend to be like that. It builds a web a lot like a black widow, kind of a cobweb mass, and it catches lots of things in those sticky strands. But when you look at it closely, it doesn't have the same coloration. There's cellar spiders, which have really long legs and kind of a really thin, elongate body, and they're almost see-through if you catch them in the right light. So there's web builders that love our house because there's a constant supply of food. I don't know if you saw, I think it was about a year ago, there was a study that showed there's over 100 different types of arthropods in everybody's home. No matter your income level or where you live, everybody has about that many. And so spiders eat a lot of the things that are hanging out in there, and that's why they're there. If you can get rid of their prey items, sometimes you get rid of the spiders, but they're also helpful. They're just your spider friend. They're getting rid of the fly that kept you up at last night or whatever.
And so what about the ones in the forest? You mentioned the one that eat fish, which is fascinating. What about the other ones?
The fishing spider would be one. There's also the wolf spiders. They love to be out in that kind of arboreal setting because there's lots of places to hide under. You could find the wood louse hunter, I would say, out in a wooded area because there's going to be so many roly-polies, the wood lice out there. They have really big, beefy mouth parts that they use to crunch up the roly-polies when they catch them. And they look very frightening, but they don't offer a lot of danger to people unless you're secretly a roly-poly pretending to be a human. That would be another one. They kind of have a khaki... They look like they work at Target. They have a khaki abdomen and looks like the rest of them is red. So it's that kind of coloration. You could find some of the different orb weavers out there. A barn spider does like to be near a structure like a barn, but they'll also build out in the woods if they can find space. I don't know how many times you've walked through a web. You become a ninja very quickly.
Exactly.
That would be another one. Long-jawed orb weavers are sometimes in areas of wooded, sort of pond-type spots, lake spots. None of them are hazardous to us. You're not going to find the most dangerous spiders in Kentucky or even in America out in these wooded settings because that's when we're starting to talk about brown recluses or you're talking about black widows. You might find a widow or two out there, but they are in different habitats normally.
So the black widows, I know there's some people have found them in their homes.
Right.
How do they just come in on their own? Or
they're going to go where they think they can build a web and get some food. So black widows often end up in lawns. They end up by gardens, by landscaping. They will be out in the woods sometimes. I know some scientists catch them out there, but they just want to be where the food is, and wherever their egg sac hatches, that's probably where they're going to set up camp.
So how many are venomous?
So every spider is capable of injecting venom.
Okay.
It's just the varying degrees of effects on people that we have to worry about.
Okay, so maybe I should have said how many are deadly.
I don't know. It's we haven't had a lot of recorded fatalities, even from things like widows and brown recluses. I don't want to swear to it, but I think the last recorded fatality from a widow was over 100 years ago.
Oh, okay.
So it's not as common as people seem to think that it is. It wouldn't be great to be bitten by a black widow, especially if you're older and infirm, or if you're younger. You want to worry about little kids getting exposed to that. I've met several people who've been bitten, and they described it as the worst flu they ever had. They hallucinated, they had fevers and chills, it was very painful. A black widow has a neurotoxin, so it kind of tap dances around in your brain and makes it a very painful experience for you. Brown recluses are a necrotoxin. That's a broader category. It kind of dissolves cells, basically. So when they're eating something, it's helping to dissolve their food. They have an all-liquid diet, spiders do. And so when they bite us, we usually start to get this little spot in your skin, a little blister. Normally that's it for most people. But some people get loxocelism, which is their scientific name. And it's a systematic breakdown where it starts to spread and you get a bigger wound. Other people get an infection. Usually people with a brown recluse bite end up with MRSA or something like that, and the wound gets bigger and bigger, and they don't seek medical attention in time. So it's not deadly, it's just disfiguring and gross if you Google image search that over lunch. So those would be some of the ones I'd say we want to avoid getting bitten by. But the other ones, it would be a lot like a bee sting or a wasp sting. You really don't have to worry about it doing anything to you. I think that insects and spiders bother people because when we think of animals, what do we think of with legs? You think of 2 or 4.
2 or 4,
right?
right.
It's too many when it starts to get 6, 8, 10, 50, 100, 500.
Right.
That's weird. And it's weird to watch them move. Like, how do they coordinate that movement? It's just, it spooks people out to think about that. Other times people talk about the eyes. They have too many eyes, or the eyes glow. I don't know if anybody out there listening has ever shown a flashlight out into a landscape and you see little tiny eyes glowing and like little orange reflections. Those are usually spiders staring
Really?
back at you. Yeah. So they do have that kind of reflective ability that freaks people out. The fur, people don't like how hairy they are. And then the venom. That's the big thing. People are worried about being bitten. So those lead to people doing crazy things. I don't know if you saw a couple years ago the person that set a gas station on fire trying to kill a spider. They saw it on the pump handle and they had a lighter and they were like, I'll just burn this spider.
Oh, no.
And then the whole web caught on fire and then the pump caught on fire and then the gas station caught on fire. People overreact to things. I mean, we see jokes about that on Facebook, right? How many times have you seen somebody with like a blowtorch and it says under, I got the spider.
Right.
Unfortunately, people do react like that in some cases, and we see destruction and pain for folks, but they're not that dangerous. You don't need to overreact like that.
I was going to say, it sounds like it's more us reacting
Right.
than the spider is actually going to cause any damage
Exactly,
to us.
exactly.
So you mentioned some of the things that the spiders eat. What eats the spiders?
Lots of things can eat spiders.
Okay.
So spiders eat each other a lot. There's a lot of cannibalism,
Okay.
even amongst siblings. So like when they come out as spiderlings at first, they might gobble each other down, and the biggest one gets to be the adult.
Oh, wow.
They are eaten by birds. They're eaten by squirrels and fish and all kinds of other creatures out there. If they can get a hold of them, they're a nice little protein snack. They're gonna get eaten.
Okay. And how you mentioned about the spider babies, how many hatch at a time? How does that work?
It depends. So with a black widow or other orb weaver type, they'd have a big egg sac, and they can make multiple egg sacs over time. So you could get, a mom could have like 500 kids after a while if she mates enough and has enough sperm. With the wolf spiders, we're talking about a brood of like 20 to 50 usually. And if you see a wolf spider, sometimes you'll see their kids hanging out on them. I've had a lot of people, they say, I stepped on the spider and all of the babies came out. Usually that means that you stepped on their mom, but you didn't get all the kids and they're running away from that corpse. It's a little morbid, perhaps.
They then eat the mother?
No,
they come back?
they want to eat something alive.
Okay.
So now they're kind of on their own. That's it's sort of a parental care kind of thing. You don't see it with a lot of spiders, but a few of them do carry the eggs around and then carry the babies on their back for a little while.
Do they teach them anything? Or
Sure, writing, arithmetic. No, nothing like that. It's just more of a making sure they get going, that they get big enough they can take care of themselves.
So that some spiders have a maternal instinct. That's a nice thing to know. Yes.
That'll be an advertisement for them.
Right, exactly.
It also kind of ties in with their relatives, the scorpions. So some scorpions exhibit parental care like that. You'll see scorpions hanging out on moms or near moms. There is a species that lives here in this area called the Kentucky scorpion or the southern devil scorpion, and it's kind of a little brown thing. It's not too big, maybe about an inch. It's kind of a dark rusty brown color. They're not very impressive. They're not very dangerous. It doesn't feel good to get stung by them, I've been told, but we've also got one in the lab right now, back in the department, and it's got all our little scorpions hanging out in there, and they're so squirmy and cute.
Cute. Okay.
Little pinchers.
How many do they have?
She's got about 10 in there, I think, but
wow.
in nature, I think they would have several more than that. But they're a little bit bigger, so I think they've gone through some development and some attrition.
So where do they live in Kentucky?
Just about anywhere wooded. I know that Lake Cumberland is a big spot where we get them from. We often have people mail them to the department. So down in that neck of the woods here in Kentucky, but it is a southern species as well, so the further south you go, the more you'll see it. But it is one of the most northern occurring scorpion species. I think Kentucky is usually out of people's vision of range for scorpions, but we have them here hanging out. It's not a dangerous scorpion. If you ever are worried about scorpions, the general rule of thumb, and this is very general, is the wider the claw is, the less dangerous it is. So if you see something like an emperor scorpion, that's the big one they use in movies a lot. They're like 3 inches long and black. They have really big, meaty claws. You could almost get a meal out of them if you were adventurous. When they have big claws like that, that means they use those to grab their food. They need less potent venom to sting it and snag it. So those claws can help you to differentiate that. The thinner it is, the more potent the venom, generally speaking, is. The Kentucky scorpion, for its size, it has a thin front, but the back part is kind of beefy for its size. So their venom isn't that hazardous.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
So their venom isn't that hazardous.
Other scorpions, if you get stung by it, can it kill you then?
There are deadly scorpions in the world. There's only about
Not
20.
in Kentucky, though.
Not in Kentucky. There are some here in America that we would consider to be in that class out in Arizona. I want to say it's called the flat rock scorpion. They are problematic. They can cause a lot of pain for people. If you go into more exotic areas, more jungly type areas or equatorial areas, that's where you start to see some really big, mean scorpions that can cause some damage. So I'd say it's like 20 or 25 species.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you get stung by a scorpion here, then you really don't need to do anything?
No, you just want to do some care. You want to just tend to the wound, make sure it doesn't get infected. You can use calamine lotion on it or ice it down, but it's going to go away after a few days, just like a bee sting for most people. Okay. This is all contingent upon you not being allergic to stuff,
right.
too, right? If you swell up with a softball under your skin after a mosquito gets you, or if you have a known honeybee venom allergy, you got to worry about everything out there. Be careful and make sure that you take care of yourself if you do get a hold of something.
So what do scorpions eat?
Scorpions will eat just anything that they can catch.
Do they eat the spiders?
They will eat some spiders if they can get them. They'll eat anything that's down in that vegetation. So this southern devil scorpion, they live in leaf litter and under logs. So if they encounter a beetle there or an ant or little larvae of different things, millipedes, I'm sure that they'll gobble any of those down. Spiders and scorpions are different than other arthropods, so crunchy, multi-legged things. They're different because they're arachnids, which means that they have chelicera, which are what we call fangs normally. So instead of chewing their food like we do and then eating it, they have to sort of cut up their food and eat tiny bits of it. Or with spiders and scorpions, what we often see is they crunch it thoroughly and slurp the juices up. So like imagine like you squeeze an orange and drink the juice right out. That's how a spider consumes most of its food. So it's not like Dracula where they sink their teeth in and pull it out.
Right.
They just keep squishing it and drinking the juices up.
So what about the kind of the rest of the shape of the body? Is there a reason why scorpions look like they do?
The tail is an adaptation for predation that they use to capture their food. When we talk about arthropods, we're talking about a segmented animal. Like each segment of the body has special traits that make it different than the last one or the next one. So some of them are turned into, in the case of scorpions and spiders, it's called the cephalothorax. When you put it all together, that's where all the legs are. That's where the eyes are. On spiders, it's where the chelicera are. On a scorpion, it's where the claws are. So the claws are actually part of their mouth. They're not part of their legs. Imagine if your canine teeth turned into a fork and a spoon over a million years. It's kind of what happened with them. And then in the rear end, they've got their digestive organs, and their tail just over time turned into this stinger. With insects, that's an ovipositor. Like females have the stinger because it used to be an egg-laying device, but now it's a venom-delivering device. With this, it's a venom gland and a stinger. It's not where they lay their eggs from.
All right, so you have one more creepy little
we're
going to talk about.
I kind of wanted to talk about stinging caterpillars. This is something we hear a lot about. At this time of year, people start getting worried about things like a hickory tussock moth. I've seen very panicked articles being shared on Facebook by lots of groups of, this black and white caterpillar. It's crawling down out of trees. It's going to kill your dog. It's going to attack your kids. and people think that it's really out to get them. There are caterpillars that we have to worry about out there that can produce this rash on our body or can inject venom into us. They have urticating hairs, but if you are respectful of them, you can coexist. They're not murderous. They're not looking to get everybody out there. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why that's important. You can't just go around pet every caterpillar you see.
Right.
Basically, it's just like dogs. If you see a dog, you ask permission to pet it, right? You don't just handle it. The same is true with caterpillars. I know we see fuzzy ones like woolly bears out there, and people love those, and that one's an okay one to touch. But others, like there's Io moth caterpillars and buck moth caterpillars. They look really nice and bushy, but if you touch them, there are these pokey hairs on their back called an urticating hair that will deliver venom into your skin, or it'll break off and get stuck in your skin. So you either end up with a rash, sometimes you get dermatitis, or in some cases people accidentally get them in their eye, and sometimes even kids ingest them, so they end up with like gastrointestinal issues for a couple of weeks. Those would be two that are part of the giant silk moth family, the Io moth and buck moth. So they're pretty big, impressive caterpillars, usually pretty obvious. If we have any arborists that are listening, sometimes you touch these when you're climbing a tree, and that's usually what happens is somebody brushes up against them as they're moving through vegetation. And that's when you start to feel a very weird prickly sensation on your skin, and it means you've gotten nailed by one of these. Some other examples are Puss Caterpillars. They look like a toupee if it grew legs and started walking around. Really long hair all over their body. Some of them even have weird appendages that come off. That would be like the monkey puss caterpillar, and it has these, it looks like tendrils that are extending off. When you touch those, the hairs get stuck in your skin. Have you ever experienced this?
Not.
Okay. There's another one called the saddleback caterpillar. That's the one we generally want people to be the most cautious of. So it looks like a couch almost, maybe almost an inch long, and then on each end it has these two projections. So it looks like a couch has been flipped upside down, and in the middle is a white and red and brown circle that looks like a saddle, and that's how they get their name. And when you touch these, you get this discoloration on your skin. It turns kind of a purpley brown. It's very painful. It can last for days, and it happens to lots of folks that are going through cornfields or tobacco fields, and they just happen to brush up against this. And people think of caterpillars as these cute and cuddly things, right? They're like the cuddly wuddly bugs. We got the hungry caterpillar and all that.
Right, exactly.
You got to give nature respect. Sometimes they come up with defensive mechanisms that we really would rather not be on the receiving end of.
I've heard several times about the weather is linked to the woolly worm.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Is that true or not?
It is not true, unfortunately. There's a lot of variables that go into creating that color pattern. So it's orange and brown, or black and brown mixed together. The bigger the black sections are, the worse the winter is supposed to be.
Yes.
There's also, I was just reading about this, there's 13 segments to a woolly bear, and there is supposedly 13 weeks of winter. Historically speaking, I don't know how accurate that is. So you could go through each of the segments and get a week-by-week prediction. So there might be a nice period in the middle or two really bad sections on the end, depending on the color.
Right.
And there is no data that supports the efficacy of this meteorological prediction by Caterpillar.
Yeah, I've noticed it's never been right when I've seen one, but it's still kind of neat to, think that way.
Yeah, and they move really fast. They go through lots of areas. So there's also myths surrounding, like, if you see them going south, that means it's going to be a bad winter because they're trying to get to Miami, like your grandparents. If you see them going north, it means everything's going to be okay. They're kind of going to hang out for the winter. But even that's not true. Yeah. But that doesn't stop us from celebrating them. Have you ever been to the Woolly Bear Festival here in Kentucky?
Yeah.
I really want to go. I think it's sometime soon. I hope to attend it at some point in the future.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. So, what is there a life cycle when they come out, like in the spring or the fall, or it just varies?
For the woolly bears?
For the caterpillars.
For caterpillars? Yeah. It depends on the species that we're talking about. Usually they overwinter as pupa or eggs. So you might see adults in the spring, or you might see caterpillars getting started in the spring. So overwintering is a really important procedure that insects do where they're trying to survive those cold temperatures, and it's easier to do that when you're just an egg or when you're in a pupal form because you don't need to eat and you don't have to move. You're just well protected. So a lot of caterpillars, or lepidopterans in this case, I guess, they'll take advantage of that, and they're either an egg laid on a branch, like with a tent caterpillar, they do that, or they're a pupa down in the soil. So Cecropia moth would be a good example of that. They make a cocoon on the side of a tree to protect them, or with the hornworms, we see them burrow into the soil and pupate, so they use the ground as protection, and then they emerge and start the whole thing over in the spring. So caterpillars are usually a summer phenomenon.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's when the things that they eat are around.
Right.
You've presented us with a lot of great information on these creepy critters from the forest. Do you have any takeaway items that you'd like our listeners to leave with?
I think just respect nature. There are lots of things out there that we can interact with, and if you respect them from afar, you're going to get to enjoy them, and you don't have to worry about suffering ill consequences from getting stung or bitten or what have you. And these things, even though they can cause us some problems, they're a part of the machinery of nature. You start taking out bits and pieces, and things don't always work as well. So don't wish away spiders. Don't squash every caterpillar you see. Just know that everything's out there kind of living its life.
For people that are listening today and they are curious about the spiders they're seeing or those caterpillars they're seeing, do you have any tools or tips for them on how to identify them or any resources that you might direct them to?
So the UK Entomology Department has a really good spider guide. If you go to our IntFacts page through the department website, there is a factoid sheet about the different spiders you can find and where they live and how to identify them. You can always send us pictures. You can email them. You can tweet them at me. I'm at BugmanJohn if you want me to take a look at a spider. If you want to do a little more local, you can try your county extension agent. They're always going to be a good resource, or they'll know who to send it to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
Thank you, Dr. Larson, for coming in and talking about spiders and scorpions and things like that on this creepy Halloween edition. We're also going to have Dr. Ellen Crocker and Megan Buland coming in and talking about some things in the forest you might not want to touch. All right, so continuing our creepy critters or things in the forest, we have Dr. Ellen Crocker and Megan Buland. Dr. Crocker is a forest extension specialist and Megan is a technician. They both are working in extension in the forest health arena. We're continuing with our Halloween theme.
So we're going to be talking about some spooky fungi and things that fungi do that are a little bit scary. And have some appropriate examples for the season that we're in.
Yeah, okay, explain that.
Well, I think perhaps when most people think about mushrooms in the woods, the first thing that comes to mind is that they can be poisonous.
Right, exactly.
They eat them, they'll die. And there are some really historical examples of people dying from having consumed mushrooms, going back to the Romans, and there are some deadly poisonous mushrooms even in our area that if you ate a few bites of could cause liver failure, death. You might need a whole liver transplant to survive, or kidney transplant. But the vast majority of mushrooms that we'd consider toxic to people, they have some toxic substance in them that when you ingest them makes you sick, just makes you really upset to your stomach, causes a lot of GI distress. Whereas, so some mushrooms have toxins in them that'll make you feel terrible, but you'll recover. And other mushrooms are going to have toxins in them that really affect your core functions and can, be lethal. But both of those are the minority. So most mushrooms really aren't going to hurt you at all. You do need to cook them, you need to prepare them. So if you knew how to identify them, you'd be safe.
Right.
But that's the key part.
Right.
I don't think any mushroom is worth the risk if you don't know.
So how do people, if they are curious, where would they go to find the resources to identify them?
Well, I think that instead of trying to pick something and think of, can you eat it? It's better to have a list of what you can eat, are safe and easily distinguishable from any poisonous mushrooms, and focus on those and try to find those. And really, there's no quick and easy checklist of what's poisonous and what's not. Like a lot of people think, if it has a white underside, it will be poisonous, or if it is this kind of mushroom, it won't be. And it's really not that clear cut. So you have to be able to just identify them, which can be really tricky. So it's, in my opinion, best to start with those that are easy to identify and just focus on that. Instead of trying to eat everything, because that is a recipe for disaster.
Or get them at a farmer's market or a grocery store.
Grow them yourself.
Right, grow them yourself.
They say that there are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but no old, bold mushroom hunters. So that tells you something. Since this is Halloween, we're talking about the scary ones. In most cases of people poisoning themselves, adults poisoning themselves with mushrooms, comes from people confusing toxic mushrooms for edible ones. So a lot of the ones that we know are deadly can kind of look like some edibles at different phases in kind of their life. And that can be a real problem, especially for those who are coming from some other part of the world and aren't familiar with the mushrooms that we have. So they might say, oh, this looks just like the one that I had in Southeast Asia where I'm from, or, in Eastern Europe, and not realize that we have some different mushrooms here, and that's not a safe bet. So anytime you're in a new place, you really have to consider that. And then sadly, another common reason for mushroom poisonings is small children, toddlers, kind of grazing, just kind of popping things in their mouth and not thinking about it. Mushrooms, I know, I'm biased. Mushrooms are amazing, and there's a wide range of different toxins that they produce that can make us sick. Of course, that's not really their goal. The mushrooms aren't out there trying to be like, how can we make people sick today? No, despite fun of that. They're using these toxins for all sorts of different reasons. They live in the soil with other microbes, other fungi, and it's basically like an all-out war all the time. And so they have lots of different compounds that help them, they normally do as fungi, and some of them were collateral damage in some of that.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
So, we're going to give you a few examples of some of those. The most kind of deadly poisonous group of mushrooms that we have are called the Amanitas. And in case you need evidence of that, the two species that come to mind as being lethally poisonous have the common names of Death Cap and Destroying Angel. So there's no
doubt.
No confusion. Yeah, those are not warm and fuzzy names. And they both have a group of toxins called the amatoxins, Amanita amatoxins. And Megan was going to share a little bit of information about those.
The Amanitas, they do contain these toxins, these chemical compounds that can have very negative effects on people, on your health. And with the amatoxins, mushroom toxins work in different ways depending upon what the chemical is, and that makes sense. And the Amanitas, they tend to target the functions of your liver, and they destroy your liver in the process. So usually what happens is the Destroying Angel and the Death Cap, the two that Dr. Crocker mentioned before, they both look super innocent. When you go to the grocery store and you see the pretty little white mushrooms in the little, plastic case, these look kind of like that. They're these really pretty white mushrooms. You think about things in nature having really bold colors to scare you off and say, hey, I'm poisonous, or I'm going to sting you or bite you. These guys don't do that. They're pure white, really pretty mushrooms. And so people look at them and they say, oh, that looks innocent. That looks like something I'd put on my pizza. So sometimes these mushrooms get picked and consumed, and they are two of the most lethal mushrooms that we know of to people. In the process of these chemicals working, they will destroy all of your liver function. If you survive this, it will be because you've had a complete liver transplant and not any other reason once that toxin has started to take effect. And it's super insidious the way this happens, because most of the time when people think about mushroom poisoning, they think of eating something and becoming violently ill, right? That's not really what happens here. Usually with these amatoxins, people consume them and they get really sick for a minute, like a horrible stomach illness, and then they feel better. And they're like, oh, whatever it was, it's past, I'm all right. And you go about your life for a few days, and then your liver starts to shut down. And at that point, there's absolutely nothing that can be done for your liver or for you. People in almost every case die of amatoxin poisoning. There are a couple of cases in which people have survived, but that is through really radical medical intervention and not through any other means.
And even just a few bites is enough to be really problematic. And there are some experimental new treatments looking at some ways to deal with it. But there's a really high probability that if you have this poisoning, you'll need a transplant in order to survive. And luckily, we can do that, and that's great. But nobody wants to do this.
Right.
No one elects to have a transplant.
So how do you know that the mushrooms in the store are the good ones?
I guarantee you they're the good ones. Luckily, we have a great system of agricultural regulation here. Right. But I will say from reports of people who have survived eating this, It was quite delicious. And if you're interested in reading any of these reports, there's one Cornell mushroom blog of someone who actually ate these and got poisoned by them and then survived, and kind of his story going through that.
Okay.
I definitely recommend checking out I Ate the Destroying Angel and Lived to Tell the Tale, or whatever it's called. So definitely check that out. Okay, another toxin that I wanted to introduce to you is called muscarine. And a whole group of mushrooms will produce this. But unlike the amatoxins that we talked about that are lethal, these can be potentially as well, but typically they're just really unpleasant. And what they cause are what are called sludge symptoms. Do you want to take any guesses at what sludge stands for? I give each letter of it stands for something.
Oh, each letter. Okay, is it stomach discomfort?
Well, it's part of it, for sure,
Okay.
yeah. So, S, salivation, you start salivating.
Okay.
L, lacrimation, you start producing tears. U, urination. D, defecation. G, gastrointestinal distress. And E, emesis, or vomiting. So basically, all of your orifices and pores and everything, just liquid coming out of all of them, and you feel terrible.
Due to eating a mushroom.
Yeah, just from eating mushroom. Don't do it. It's not
And
worth
do
it.
they have these in Kentucky?
Yeah, there's a whole
no.
set of them that produce these. In fact, we're going to be talking about one of them, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom.
Oh, no.
Produces some of these. So, have you heard of the jack-o'-lantern mushroom before?
I have not.
Oh, well, that's a good one for this time of year. It's one that kind of pops up in the fall. It's really eye-catching and beautiful, in my opinion. It's got this orangish color, kind of like a pumpkin. Maybe that's where it gets its name from. And they all kind of come up in big clusters from the base of a tree, or maybe some roots that are buried underground, fall or late summer. And just by themselves, they're pretty, but some people confuse them for chanterelles, which are a mushroom that people forage for. And unfortunately, jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, while chanterelles are edible and great, chanterelle mushrooms will make you very sick and give you those sludge symptoms.
Oh my goodness.
But on the bright side, it's really easy to distinguish the two. They have really clear different traits. So kind of as we were talking about, how do you learn to identify mushrooms, even some basic knowledge of that at least will tell you the difference between a jack-o'-lantern and a chanterelle. But jack-o'-lanterns do something else that's really interesting, in that they bioluminesce. So another spooky thing that you might see is you might be walking around in the woods in the night and see something glowing off in the distance.
Oh my
And
goodness.
it could be a ghost, or it could
be a
mushroom. So some mushrooms produce this blue-green glow, and it's from a light-emitting substance called luciferin. Many species do this, not just the jack-o'-lanterns, but they produce a little bit of light. People call this foxfire or other things. We've known about it for a long time, and maybe some of the people listening have seen this out in the woods. I'm here to say that it's quite faint. So don't.
Well, I was like, so is that a way to turn your lights off and check your mushrooms to make sure?
Definitely not. I would not recommend that. This is more kind of like an interesting thing that you might see sometimes in the woods, but is by no means guaranteed. So I have sat in the dark with some jack-o'-lantern mushrooms and never seen them do this. I think it's very faint. So people who have those really slow exposure photographs will catch some. Have you ever seen this before?
No, I haven't. And I've looked at jack-o'-lanterns in the dark. I think that almost everyone, and there's a mycologist who's made this comment, that almost everyone who really loves mushrooms and mycology has probably at some point spent some time sitting in the dark with a bunch of jack-o'-lantern mushrooms waiting for them to glow. And has
They
been
never do.
sorely
It's
disappointed.
very disappointing. Yeah. So moving on, Megan's going to tell you about another very spooky fungus that's out there.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Halloween, and one of the things that I like to do around Halloween, and maybe other people do too, is watch some kind of spooky movies. You know, the ones that aren't too scary, but kind of make you go like the bump in the night things. And zombie movies definitely fall into that category. And these days, there's no shortage of zombie movies out there that can scare you. But there are organisms in real life that make us think of these zombie movies, and some of these are fungi. And thankfully, there aren't any of these fungi that affect people, but they do affect a lot of different kinds of insects and other arthropods. Arthropods meaning things that don't have their skeleton on the inside of them. It's on the outside as a hard shell, like crabs and mollusks, things like that. So what these fungi do, they're called, mostly they're Cordyceps fungi, and there's another group that we'll talk about in just a minute, but the Cordyceps are a group of fungi that parasitize these insects. And what they do is there's a little innocuous mushroom spore sitting around on a branch or blowing in the breeze. And when it lands on the right kind of insect, you have to keep in mind that mushrooms can produce thousands and millions of spores, so there's a lot of them to go around. But when it lands on the right kind of insect, the spore reacts with chemicals on the insect, and those chemicals tell the spore, oh, okay, here's the perfect target. And they start to germinate. They produce mycelium, which is like the structural network of a fungus, and it starts to invade the insect's body. And they get inside the insect, and they tend to take up the insect's entire system with mycelium, and they start to affect the way the insect acts. They actually hijack the insect's brain function, just like a zombie would, and they control what that insect does. And this is usually for the benefit of the fungus and to help it perpetuate its life cycle and spread and make more fungi. So like with some ants, you've probably seen this maybe on a nature documentary where they make these ants, the fungus that's inside the ant makes it march up to like a really high branch or a leaf in the top of a tree, and there the ant suddenly freezes and becomes really rigid and paralyzed, and this big fungal fruiting body erupts out of the ant's head and spreads its spores in the wind to infect other ants. And there are actually documented cases of where the fungus actually directs the ant to stand on a branch over an area where other ants walk.
Wow.
To try to infect more ants. So, not saying that these fungi have a diabolical plan, but there is definitely something that happens there that directs these insects to do that in the fungus's life cycle, which is really, really wild to think about. Another really popular cordyceps that people may have heard of is this cordyceps that is purported to possibly have medicinal properties, and these are found through a lot of Asia. They live at really high elevations in places like Nepal and India and Bhutan, and it's called Ophiocordyceps sinensis. And it's this specific species of Cordyceps fungus that infects the caterpillars of the larval stage of this moth species. And these caterpillars, they live underground. That's where they grow and mature. And that's where these fungal spores are also. So they come in contact with the caterpillar, and again, they invade the caterpillar's system and completely overtake its body, make it burrow to a certain point in the soil, and position its body a certain way. And then after it's sat all winter, these fungi will erupt out of the caterpillar and up through the ground, and people can find them sticking up out of the ground. And in traditional Chinese medicine, these are very highly valued to have some qualities that people find beneficial. And so now there's actually a huge trade in these cordyceps fungi, and people actually wage warfare between different groups over these fields where they know that these fungi grow. And people have been killed in the process of trying to defend their patches where they can find these cordyceps. So, though these cordyceps don't control people directly, they do control people's actions and cause some really negative effects. And one other insect fungus that is really, really cool, it's not actually a cordyceps, but it acts the way a cordyceps does, is a fungus that was recently described and discussed a couple years ago. Maybe you saw this in a science magazine. It's a massive Spora fungus. It's the name of the group of fungi. And this fungus is not a cordyceps, but it acts very similarly in that it infects cicadas. Cicadas here in the U.S., you can find this in your backyard if you look hard enough. You might find one of these fungi, and they infect the cicada. They take up the cicada's entire body with their own mycelium, and then parts of the cicada start to fall off. So this cicada is walking around just perfectly fine, like life is good, with parts of its body missing. And these big clumps of fungal spores and mycelium sticking out of it. And it's really wild how they do this, because what they found is that these fungi are absolutely packed with all kinds of psychoactive compounds and really dangerous chemicals that just completely hijack these cicadas. So they're wandering around missing part of them and just perfectly okay
perfectly
with it.
fine.
So these aren't actually cordyceps, but they act the same way that a cordyceps does. And there's all these fungi that parasitize and hijack insects and can have really interesting effects on the insect themselves, which is usually negative for the insect, but pretty interesting for us. And if you want to learn more about cordyceps, you can usually find them growing here in North America. The really famous species are usually found in the tropics, the ones that you see on the nature documentaries and in pictures. But there's plenty of cordyceps that grow right around here, and if you look hard enough, you might see some remains of insects with weird stuff growing out of them on leaves and branches, and those might be cordyceps growing right here in Kentucky.
Zombie mushrooms in your own backyard. But never fear, we don't know of any cordyceps species so far that infect people. We'll leave that for the horror movies.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yet.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming in. We greatly appreciate that. We hope we haven't scared everyone from not going out in the woods anymore. But take time to go out in the woods and see what's out there. You never know when you'll find something spooky. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for wildlife sounds from the forest. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
Okay, Matt, you might be keeping up with our Halloween theme a little too well, but I don't think that's a zombie in the woods.
Correct. Yeah. So we're going to take a little bit of an odd spin on this, and we're here at University of Kentucky, so that sounds pretty familiar if you've ever been to a sporting event, because it's actually a sound of a bobcat. But the reason I'm putting it on here is because we're going to try to keep with the Halloween theme, black cats, and we're trying to talk about wildlife, and black cats, as we think of in terms of a house cat, aren't really wildlife.
Right.
I thought it'd be fun to bring up the topic of black panthers in Kentucky. The reason we have a bobcat and not a black panther sound is because black panthers don't exist. There is no such thing as a black panther.
Really? I did not know that.
Correct. Yeah, so we hear a lot about folks that, especially in Appalachia and across the South and the Northeast and everywhere I've been, I run into stories about people seeing black panthers, which is kind of funny because though it's possible that we have a mountain lion in Kentucky, because we have them coming from South Dakota now on a more frequent basis, so we don't have them as a population yet. We don't have reproducing mountain lions. Black panthers, and the story of black panthers is really interesting because there is no such thing. There is no black gene known to exist in the mountain lion, and black panthers is not a species. So how do you have such a thing seen if it's not
just a Marvel
in existence?
Character.
Yeah, right? It's a Marvel character. That's right. I keep forgetting about that. So, yeah, I figured that we could talk a little bit about black cats and where black cats actually do exist, which is not really in North America, is your leopard species in Asia and Africa can have black within them. Okay, so obviously not here. Unless it's an escaped pet. And then what will happen sometimes is our closest way of getting a black cat in North America is the Jaguar, which there's some in Mexico, and you go down into South America, and their numbers are, they're a giant cat, almost, 350, 400 pounds. They're huge. And they have that really nice pattern on them. Well, they can get a very, very dark pattern where they're almost black.
Okay.
But usually when you get a picture and look at them closely, you can actually still see that pattern in that pelage.
Okay.
So
if people say they saw one in Kentucky, what are they actually seeing?
Well, that's a great question. That's a tough thing to answer because I wasn't there. I didn't see it. In theory, right, it could be a lot of different things. It could be just a black cat that, because of perspective, and this, I'm guilty of this, and you look at a cat crossing the field and it looks huge, and then you go over and say put a tree next to it that size, and all of a sudden it's, it is the 12-pound house cat that was walking across the field.
Right.
So that's one thing. You can see a black lab run, you catch a glimpse of a dog run across a road or something, and you're a couple hundred yards out, it may look like a cat. So that's a possibility. And one of the things that I have seen a picture of, and is truly in existence in Kentucky, and the reason that we have the sound that we did, there is a black bobcat that was caught on camera 2 years ago that's in existence, which is incredibly rare. Back in 2016, someone in Canada caught one, and it was the 12th known cat of that color in existence.
Wow.
So with all the bobcats that we have, to put it in perspective, how often does that black cat occur in that species? It does, but not very often.
Not very often.
No.
So about bobcats.
Sure.
What do they eat? Where are they normally? Are they in the mountain ranges or anywhere?
We've got bobcats all over the place, and they are kind of a nice recovery and success story about their populations bounce back. They eat a lot of rodents, a lot of squirrels and rabbits, and if they get a chance of grabbing a turkey, they will. It's not as often as people think.
Right.
Mostly they eat a lot of squirrels.
Okay.
A lot of squirrels, which I think people really complain about missing squirrels too much.
Right. There's a lot of squirrels too.
yes. So, no, they're able to get up to 30, 40 pounds, so they can get quite big, and they actually look way bigger than they really are because of their legs and their fluff. So 30-pound cat can be a rather large, intimidating animal if you're looking at it.
So do they live in dens, or what do they live in?
When they have kittens, they'll be in a den.
So they're called kittens.
They're called kittens. Okay. Yep. They'll be in a den with them until to try to keep them warm and safe. And they actually move them around quite a bit because coyotes, if they find them, will kill them, along with dogs, potentially other male cats. But most of the time, when they're adults, they try to find blowdowns or really thick vegetation to hide in during the day, and they do some nighttime hunting. They do some daytime hunting, so you can see a cat walking around. But for how many bobcats we have, they're not seen very often because they're a cat, and they hide and they move very slowly and cautiously, and they hunt by chasing and stealthy sneak up on their prey. So they don't like being seen.
Would you see any in Lexington?
We have them in Fayette County.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some. If you get closer to the river, I'm sure Raven Run has one, I believe, that has been confirmed here this year. So it is possible that they're coming into the city a little less likely, but definitely within the county.
Well, thanks for talking about black cats.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.